Aristotle treated philosophy as the science which studies the first principles and causes. Yeah? And as I've told you, there are at least 4 names which can be used in order to refer to this field of knowledge. First, philosophy, the science of being, theology. These 3 are original names used by Aristotle in order to refer to this theoretical science, which is the highest of all theoretical sciences. And metaphysics, that's a later term which was coined by the editors of Aristotelian works. So first philosophy is called first because it studies the first principles and highest causes that underlie all phenomena. Then another name which is used in order to refer to philosophy is the science of being. That is the intrinsically meaningful, the proper name, yeah, can be used to refer to philosophy, because philosophy is the study of being. The first principles and the highest causes should be explanatory with regard to the being itself. So it studies the nature of being, and the major question of philosophy is what is being insofar as being, being qua being. Yeah? So every science presupposes that it studies some sort of being, and philosophy, it studies the very nature of being as it is. Theology, that's another term which can be nominally used in order to refer to philosophical enterprise. So what is the most far-going intention of the first philosophy? The far-going intention is to reveal the primary sort of being, the sort on which all other beings depend. And as we shall see, Aristotle intends to show that the quintessence of being, the ultimate and the purest form of being, is divine substance, which is a material form. He also made account of this divine substance in kind of naturalistic terms, the mover, the unmoved mover of the world. And at the same time, he used metaphysical concept, the concept of nous, that is intelligence, which is the source of teleological determination of what is happening in the world. And he borrowed this term from the philosophy of Anaxagoras. And finally, metaphysics, ta metaphysica, the things after the nature of things. Yeah? After or beyond, that is the meaning of this meta part of the complex term metaphysics. As theology, it studies entities outside the realm of natural physical objects. So, of course, the problem of being can be explicated at the initial stages of inquiry through the study of the main constituents of being of particular material objects. That was Aristotle's account. And that was Aristotle's approach, actually, which he employed to start with the explication of the causes that underlie the ontological structure of material things, and then to find the relation of these causes to the highest cause, which is the unmoved mover of the world. But as first philosophy, it starts from the study of nature, yeah? Which is better known to us. And it goes beyond what is assumed and presupposed by other sciences. Metaphysics, in this sense, is a theoretical approach which goes far beyond the naturalistic assumptions of other sciences. In fact, Aristotle, in his work Metaphysics, discusses the relationship between such fundamental concepts as being and essence. The original Greek term, which is used to refer to essence, is ousia. Matter and form, potentiality and actuality, these are the fundamental metaphysical concepts. And Aristotle identifies different causes when just analyzing the ontological structure of particular material things. material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. And if we're talking about the ontological structure of particular material things, they are assumed to be composed of form and matter, and this view now is denoted as heliomorphism. Heli is matter, morpho is form. Then, besides that, the cause of change and motion, that is called the efficient course, and the final course, the purpose, which predetermines almost every process, specifically in sphere of entities who have the capacity of being alive. So in metaphysics, Aristotle gives proof of the fact that substance, or primary being, must be sought among these structural features, form and matter, and the compound of form and matter. And finally, as we shall see, Aristotle comes to the conclusion that the primary ontological element in the structure of every particular material object is its form, formal course. It is the form or essence, which is ontologically basic constituent of everything's being. So forms meet different criteria for primary being. They meet this criteria better than matter, which is potentiality, some possibility of acquiring some form and being transformed into some particular material thing, and metaform composites. So, and it is the actual presence of a certain form in the matter that is the cause for a changing material thing to be fully real and fully existent, and to be well determined and essentially complete. So, form is the essence, which cannot be separated from the thing of which it is essence, and with regard to this principle, Aristotle treated critically Plato's theory of form, because Plato separated forms from particular material things and treated them as invariant universal entities. And the main intention of Aristotle is just to stress the relation between essence and particular material being, between essence and thing of which it is essence, and to reveal the mechanisms through which that essence turns out to be realized or actualized in the structure of being of this particular material thing. So that was the first part of the overall project of metaphysics. And the second part of the study of supersensible reality. Aristotle turns to divine forms. Actually, he rejected Plato's theory of forms as ideal metaphysical non-material entities, but nevertheless he recognized that at least one immaterial form should be postulated within his metaphysical system. Aristotle claims that there is something that is separate and distinct from nature as a whole. This that changes God, which is the ultimate cause of change and motion, and the source of the teleological determination of the natural processes. So God is whole and perfectly active and ergon. And God is the absolute purest form of being. God is nothing but its essence, and its essence's per activity can be explicated in terms of analogy with intellectual activity. In the medieval ages, Thomas Aquinas borrowed this view from Aristotle and used it in order to develop philosophical explanation of the nature and essence of God. He introduced God as actus purus, or pure act of being. So metaphysics begins by characterizing wisdom as the kind of knowledge most worth having, and wisdom is treated as virtue by Aristotle. And that is the knowledge of the first principles and causes. And when analyzing the ontological structure of particular material object, Aristotle identifies at least 4 different types of causes. Material cause, what something is made of, material stuff. Efficient cause, the source of motion. Formal cause, a thing's form or essence, which is the most essential form, the main constituent of the reality of a particular material object. And final cause, a thing's reason or purpose, yeah, or the intention behind it. We can compare this final cause, or telos, that is the original Greek term, with a kind of program, yeah, which is built into the physical constitution of an organism, for instance, DNA. Yeah? Okay, so let's make account of these causes as they were presented by Aristotle. We'll start with material cause. It is not the ultimate cause. Yeah? Nevertheless, it explains something. The stuff out of which this or that particular material thing is made of. The matter. The original Greek term is hule. This is a passive element. It is devoid of any ability of self-generation, self-production, or even self-motion. Yeah? So matter should be understood in relation to form. Matter is always to be understood in relation to form, the form which makes the material thing into the determinate and well-defined thing that it is. It doesn't make sense to talk about bricks and some timber of particular house without any relation to the form of a house, to the essence of a house. Yeah? Because, you know, the bricks are the matter of the house only in relation to the form of the house, the structural principle, yeah, which, when combined with bricks, results in the house. Of course, we can talk about bricks and timber, taking them in their own reality as they are in their actual existence. In abstracto, just without any relation to the house. But that means that we are talking of particular material objects, and we refer mainly to the form of a certain matter. For instance, the matter out of which a particular brick is made of. So we refer to the brickness of a certain material stuff. You see? So that is a hierarchy of forms in nature and hierarchy of entities. That is what this principle implies. So, formal course is the most important and the most essential constituent of the ontological reality of a particular material thing. It cannot be merely reduced to the shape or to the external spatial form of a particular material object, because the shape of an object may be accidental. For instance, the height or weight of an individual, or the size of his or her arms and his or her head. It may be in no relation to the nature of an object. So that is why when we're talking about the formal course, we mainly refer to the essence, to that which determines this or that particular material things in terms of its essential properties. Take, for instance, water. Water is a natural substance of a natural kind, that is, some stuff. What is the formal course of water? It cannot be reduced merely to shape, but in order to reveal the form of this natural substance, which we call water, we should analyze the structure and the principle of the chemical combination of its elements. And that is what is expressed by the formula H2O. These are the elements, hydrogen and oxygen. These are the material causes. But what is needed is a certain principles of their combination, which transforms the synthesis of these elements into this natural substance, which is called water. It is the principle of their combination and synthesis which can be identified as the form of the water. See? Anyway, Aristotle treats form as essence. A thing is defined by its form, not its matter. Because, for instance, take for instance this table that is made out of plastic, but we can make lots of things out of plastic. We can use this material stuff. We can just process it into something else, into other material things. And that means that material stuff, it is only it has some potential properties. It has some natural dispositions to be processed, to be transformed into something determinate. But in itself, this material stuff simply is just the indeterminate possibility. When we start processing or constructing some particular object out of this material stuff, we make this indeterminate possibility more or less determinate. For instance, if I decided to make a table out of this piece of wood, then the abstract possibility of transforming this piece of wood into something determinate becomes the concrete possibility of creating a table as a determinate material entity which is identified through the form imposed on this piece of wood. So the form is the essence. It is a set of essential characteristics. So, and Aristotle would also say that the essence of form is the definition of a thing, because it is what we grasp in the definition. We do not refer to this plastic table as a piece of plastic. We refer to it as a table. So the form comes first. We place the form on the first place when giving the definition of a thing. We do assume that this form is somehow imposed on some material stuff, and we also assume that this material stuff is somehow arranged, but it is arranged according to the principle which is implicitly given in a certain form. Okay, I'll close the window because it's let's go further. We can pose the question, for instance, what is the formal course of a living being? I mean, what is the formal course of an organism? Living creatures. Living creatures, they may have different externally articulated corporeal shapes, for instance, the form of my corporate substance, the shape of my body. Yeah, but all this can be explained in terms of some functions performed by my organs, and all these functions are coordinated, as Aristotle claimed, by the soul, which is responsible for coordinating all these functions of a living being, of an organism, and is responsible for coordinating and directing their activity at the ultimate goal, which is just sustaining life in this organism. In these terms, we can explicate the principle of the formal course of a living being as a soul, psyche. It animates bodies, and if certain corporeal entity has the intrinsic capacity of being alive, so it is the soul which provides the actualization or realization of this capacity, and it sustains the operation of this capacity in a purposeful way. So it is the soul of psyche. It is defined as the form of a body, not the external shape, because the external shape can be explained in terms of the various functions of an organism, and all those functions, they are necessary in order to sustain life, and it is the soul which is responsible for coordinating those functions and sustaining life in the organism as a whole. That's why the soul is presented as the form of a body, yeah? Or the formal course of a body. Yeah? Let's turn to the efficient course. What puts the form in the matter, some activity here, and consider the examples given by Aristotle of the operation of this efficient course. The artist courses the being and growth of a house. A living thing is brought into being and thus caused to grow by its parent through the process of generation. Yeah? So as the carpenter causes the house to grow according to a form in his or her mind, so does the natural thing grow according to its own form imparted to it by its parent. So we can just, for instance, take as the analogical concept which can be applied in this case, the DNA, yeah? The built-in program. But in this case, the efficient course coincides with the final course. So the form or soul of nature makes the animal what it is and makes it grow into that kind of thing, human course. So anyway, when we are talking about efficient course, we mean the fact which is brought about by the operation of a certain course or certain principle. And see, if we take as an instance of the operation of the efficient course, the third type of course, we are likely to identify, for instance, as that affects substance as a child, and artifacts, for instance, aesthetic, which is produced by an artisan, and also events. So these are the effects produced by these efficient courses: substances, the birth of a child, artifacts, and events in natural process. So efficient causation is cited when explaining the possibility of change in something and when explaining the overall natural process. Okay. And final course, that is the purpose or end of something. We got accustomed to explain physical processes in terms of the efficient course, and we also tend to explain economic events in terms of the efficient courses. Of course, we do take into account the ends of economic agents, but we simply subsume them under the analyzed concept of preferences or revealed preferences. See? But yet Aristotle was the first to talk about the purpose which is built into the natural process, and that is called objective teleology. The purpose or end is telos. The end of a process of growth is its purpose, a goal, yeah, or telos in Greek. So your goal is to get education, to become professionals, yeah, in a particular field, in the field of finance, for instance, and that is your telos. And when you attain this state of just being well-educated professionals, that is called entelechia. So you may refer to this state of the accomplished achievement, or to the state of the accomplishment of your education, as entelechia. The final course, on Aristotle's terms, in Aristotle's own terms, the final course, the end, is what is posited in order to explain for the sake of what the process is going on. Yeah? That is the completion of the process. And Aristotle claimed that not only artificial objects are produced by deliberate activity of a man are subjected to explanation, which involves the concept of purpose or purposeful action, intentional action, the concept of final course, but also natural things and natural processes. Yeah? That as if just this purpose or end or telos is built into the physical entity and determines the activity of this entity. Once again, we can just use the analogy of DNA, yeah, kind of genetic program, which determines the life evolution of our organism. So now let's see how these concepts, matter and form, are related to the concepts of potentiality and actuality. In metaphysics, Aristotle introduces the distinction between matter and form synchronically. Yes. He applied it to an individual substance at a particular time. But Aristotle also applies the distinction between matter and form diachronically, across time. The process of evolution, the process of formation, yeah? It involves two different ontological states. What is, what actually exists, and what is still coming to be. What is still information. So this connects the matter-form distinction to the distinction between potentiality and actuality. And that is another fundamental ontological dimension of the reality of things or entities. First, in physics, yeah, this distinction becomes of crucial importance when Aristotle gives account of the possibility of change, of motion in nature. The motion is just coming from the potential state to the actual state. In metaphysics, the concepts of potentiality and actuality are of great importance because these concepts are applied in order to conceive those aspects of being that fall out of typical categorical predicative structure for our thinking and stating of what it is. We use lots of categories, yeah, in order to highlight various profiles of reality of a particular material entity. First, we fix the fact of its being, and then we have to answer the question, what is it? So we use the category of essence. And then when we fix this thing and identify its essence, we can go on and highlight lots of other aspects of its being. So the reality of a particular material entity turns out to have lots of profiles. Where, how many, what is the relation of this entity to other entities, what is its activity, yeah? And how it is affected by other entities. So we use the whole scope of categories: space, time, affection, yeah, action. So these categories enable us to highlight various profiles of being. That is why Aristotle claims that being is articulated in various ways, and it has lots of meanings, but they all converge in something which is identified as an entity having a certain essence. So all those categories, they have focal meaning, but there is something which also goes beyond these categorical structures: potentiality and actuality. And these concepts are of real great importance in the whole metaphysical project, because it is the actualization or realization, yeah, of a certain potentiality, which is the intrinsic principle, the principle which determines the nature of being qua being. To be real, to be fully existent, means to attain the highest degree of actuality. That is, to be a determined and well-defined thing with a whole spectrum of essential characteristics, which this thing must have, not in possibility, not in potentia, but in actum. And it is the form that makes the thing into the determined and well-defined thing that it is. That means that the form turns out to be actualized or realized through the imposition of a certain material stuff, and that is what makes this or that particular thing real. Another very important aspect of metaphysical analysis of Aristotle, the form of a changing material thing is itself changeless. The generation of a particular material thing must be understood as the generation of something, the particular material thing, out of something, out of its matter. So let's consider the process of the generation. The generation of a particular material thing of a certain form involves some changes, but it is not the form which is changing. It is only the matter which is transformed, processed, and somehow arranged, yeah, in order to give birth to a certain thing of a certain form. So for a particular material thing of a certain form to be generated is for some matter to become a particular material thing of that form. So the only thing that is generated here is precisely the particular material thing of a certain form. So the form itself is not involved in change, and there is a set of forms in the overall system of nature. They are invariant. They are simply reproduced by particular material entities, such as your genetic sequence, yeah, can be reproduced by the members of your family, by the further generations. But the DNA itself is not subjected to any change. So, and we can use this DNA analogy. Yeah? The form is transmitted or passed over by the father to his child. And this form is both the efficient course, some DNA here, and the form of the child. And so this, and the final course, of course, the final course, because this form of the child can be glossed in terms of the child's end or complete development. So a natural process counts essentially as the development of, say, an oak or a man, because its very identity depends on the complete form realized at its end. So the end is an intentional or unintentional, but anyway, it is the intrinsic governing principle of the process. And that is how our genetic program operates. It is the intrinsic governing principle of the process of the natural evolution of our organism. That is the efficient course as well as the final course, which is built into our organic entity. I think that this analogy is quite appropriate. Let's go further. Aristotle has argued that in the sensible world there are substances, and what makes them such is their form. These forms are internal essential principles of natures, and these forms, they can exist without matter because they simply operate within the spectrum of material things. Forms, they couldn't exist apart from those things in which they are instantiated or realized. Yeah? But the next major step in the general ontological program developed by Aristotle was just to investigate supersensible reality. And in some of the books of his treatise Metaphysics, he considers some of the non-sensible items, such as mathematical objects and Platonic forms, which actually do not exist. He rejected this reality of supersensible ideal forms. Nonetheless, they are supersensible beings of a different kind, and this supreme supersensible being, according to Aristotle, is the unmoved mover of God. He postulated the existence of at least one immaterial and supreme form, and this form was introduced as the mover of the world, the source of the teleological or purposeful process sustained by the energy of the operation of this unmoved mover. So the unmoved mover is an entity of the highest ontological value. The unmoved mover is itself unchangeable, but it is an eternal source of the motion of the outmost celestial sphere, and it also is represented as the final determination of the overall world process. It is the final course of every motion in the world, and it moves as an object of love. God is incapable of being other than it is. God is the manifestation of the purest form of being. It is the purest form of being. It is the very substance of being, the actuality or energia. This actuality is activity of the best sort, intelligent activity, which has nothing to do with matter. In case of material things, the presence of matter precludes them from being perfect in their actuality. That means that every material thing can be dissoluted, can be processed into another material thing, or simply cease to exist because of this material course, which is potentiality. And as for the unmoved mover, it doesn't have this material stuff in its ontological structure. It doesn't have any potentiality. It is absolute actuality. That is why it is called God. That moved mover is a kind of living being which is eternally engaged in the best kind of activity, which is the activity of thinking. And God's intelligence is not a thinking of us or of the universe, but rather is a thinking of thinking, or that is the comprehension of itself. And this activity is the good, and that is the source of the order and the goodness of the universe. That is the strong metaphysical claim, but the strongest metaphysical claim in Aristotle's philosophy. So that is why we can also reveal some theological implications of Aristotle's metaphysics. So in metaphysics, we we begin our analysis, and we move toward an understanding of divine substance by starting with the causes of the things that are most familiar to us, particular material things. And then we process towards an understanding of the highest causes. The causes and principles of different things are in one sense different, and in another sense, thinking generally, by analogy, they are the same of all things. And then moved mover is the cause analogous to those causes and principles of perceptible substances studied by the special sciences. And anyway, Aristotle treats God as the highest cause and the final cause of motion in the world. The final cause of motion of the atmosphere. This is analogous to the way in which the nature of an animal of some type is the final cause of the coming to be of animals of that type. So that is the objective process, which has the efficient and teleological determination, of course. That is Aristotle in the universe. And the eternal continuous activity is what constitutes the very nature of this entity, which is called the unmoved mover or God, energia. That is the pure actuality. To understand actuality, we should start with an understanding of the manner in which the change is an actuality, and then we should move further to an understanding of the substance of perceptible bodies in actuality. And the highest course is grasped when we attain the understanding of the best and the most perfect actuality. And this is an understanding of God, of some immaterial form, and God is actuality and singularity. So it is the absolute paradigmatic instance of being, or maybe the ideal being, the ideal form of being. That is the quintessence of being. And all things that are real, they exist, developed, and move due to the theological determination, and the source of this teleological determination is this unmoved mover, the absolute paradigmatic instance of being. So that was Aristotle Metaphysics. A few words I'd like to say about the philosophy in late antiquity. There were lots of schools of the so-called Hellenistic philosophy. So all those schools were characterized by the intensive interest to the problems of ethics and discipline of human life. But besides ethics, of course, there were inquiries into the nature of being. Those inquiries were subsumed under the general term of physics, and the nature of knowledge. Those inquiries were subsumed under the general term logic. So this was the structure of philosophical knowledge, logic, the science of rationality, and a theory of knowledge. Physics, the study of nature, process, and the reality. And of course ethics, the study of the foundations of our practical choices and the strategy of life. So there were several influential schools, and all those schools, they anticipated the inevitable end of the ancient civilization. Consider, for instance, Stoicism. Originally, the school of Stoics encompassed lots of theories. Some of the theories were developed by Zeno of Critium, and later they were espoused by Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. So there were Greek Stoics and Roman Stoics as well. And Stoics taught self-control and fortitude as a means of overcoming destructive emotions. Yeah, the ideal was that of clear judgment and inner calm. Yeah? Accepting destiny while releasing yourself from suffering, from fears. Or the school of cynicism. Cynics rejected all conventional desires. You know, the famous figure of cynic was Diogenes, who lived there in a vat there. So they advocated a life free from all possessions and property from all passions there. That was the manifestation of the intention to achieve virtuous states, or skepticism as well, known as Pyrrhonism. Skeptics turned out to be very influential in Platonic Academy. So they claimed that we can never know the true inner substance of things. And finally, Epicureanism, named for its founder Epicurus. The main goal was to attain happiness, tranquility, once again to employ philosophical strategies in order to get rid of fears, such as the fear of death or fear of gods, and to cultivate friendship, living some modest life apart from the public sphere, and limiting desires and taking care of mental health and enjoying life. Yeah? That was the core ideas of Hellenistic philosophical schools. So now we're going to turn to medieval philosophy. Medieval philosophy, the philosophy of the medieval ages. Medium evum, yeah? Medium evum, that is the Latin term which is used in order to refer to this period in the history of culture in Western European countries and elsewhere. Medieval philosophy is the philosophy of Western Europe from about 2nd, 4th to 15th centuries. That was the period between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance of the 15th century. The very term medium evum was first used to designate this period between the ancient and modern worlds in the 17th century, between the ancient or classical intellectual tradition and the Renaissance. Yeah? And in later historical writing, there was a radical opposition between the Middle Ages, which were referred to as Dark Ages, and the initial phase of the modern era called the Renaissance. But in fact, this radical opposition is not justified, because, you know, in the Middle Ages, European culture is characterized by the intensive growth. But what was the intrinsic feature of this medieval culture? The European culture of the Middle Ages is characterized by the dominant role of religious views, values, and ideologies. So in Europe, if we turn to European countries, so the medieval culture was integrated by the spirit of religious adherence to Christian beliefs, yeah? Christian religious beliefs, and the establishment of Christian religious doctrine and the spread of Christian views had turned out to be the prominent factors of the growth and intensive development of culture in the Middle Ages. So medieval philosophy was a mixture of two main ingredients: the Greek philosophical heritage and Christianity. All the Greek philosophers, including new Platonists, exerted their influence on Latin philosophers in the first instance only indirectly, because actually the writings of ancient Greek philosophers had to be translated from Greek into Latin. The original works of ancient Greek philosophers, or the copies of those works written in ancient Greek, were accessible to some of the representatives of the so-called Eastern patristics, the representatives of the schools of theology and philosophy operating in Alexandria and Cappadocia, because they were mainly Greek-speaking people. They were capable of reading these original sources. But of course, not all of the work of ancient philosophers were accessible to the medieval thinkers. Among Plato's works, the most influential and widely spread work was Plato's dialogue Timaeus. In this dialogue, Plato introduced his view of the origin of cosmos, and he introduced the figure of a divine artisan, demiurge, who creates things, who actually forms things, generates things of or material cosmos through the imposition of some forms on material stuff. And that is not the process of creating world out of nothing. That is the world of just producing artifacts. And that's the fundamental difference between the way how Plato introduced the creation of cosmos. That is the process which was accounted for in terms of the production of artifacts through the activity of divine artisan who arranged some material stuff according to the pre-established paradigmatic ideal form, and the creation of the world by the activity of Christian God. The creation of the world out of nothing. And it was the radical difference between these views on the origin of the universe. So, Christian doctrine was the most essential ingredient of medieval worldview and philosophy, and this religious element is what really separates early medieval philosophy from late classical pagan philosophy. And Christian institutions sustain medieval intellectual life, and Christianity's texts and ideas provide rich subject matter for philosophical reflection. So, and when we're talking about medieval philosophy, we simply use the following criterion. Medieval philosophy began when philosophers began to measure their speculations against theological doctrine, and it ended when philosophers stopped doing that. So, what was the role of philosophy with regard to this religious worldview, and how this religious worldview influenced philosophy? That's an interesting and the most disputable question. We should make distinction between studia divinitatis, or more or less systematic studies of theological questions, and metaphysical inquiries. They were interrelated in the Middle Ages. Studia divinitatis were of primary importance. That is what was assumed by the whole theological enterprise. Sometimes theology took priority of any science and philosophy as well. Theologians, apologists, scholastics, they were preoccupied by examination, clarification, and interpretation of Holy Scripture and Orthodox text, and they worked at dogmatic formulas and searched for the best ways of understanding of the truth of Christianity. And some of the principles of religious doctrine were subjected to rational explication and demonstration in order to make the understanding of those principles more clear and sophisticated and intelligent. So, and we should also take into account that there was no professional boundary between theology and philosophy. Yeah? Theologians, especially scholastics, couldn't do without philosophy, and they were aware of some arguments and concepts developed by ancient authors, and some of the ancient philosophical conceptions were rejected as totally incompatible with Christian doctrine, but some ideas, arguments, and concepts were treated critical consideration and were adapted to this new project, the project of Christian theology. And philosophy was mainly associated with the exercise of reason. It is the knowledge which, as its source, the natural light of reason. Yeah, the natural light of reason. Philosophy is not synonymous with all knowledge, but philosophy, even with this limitation, covers both the physical and the moral sciences. It has these theoretical and practical dimensions. And in the Middle Ages, there gradually grew up rather sharp distinction between those things that can be known through the unaided reason, the exercise of reason, without any assistance on the part of some divine revelation, and those things that can only be known through a supernatural or divine revelation. You see, and philosophy turned out to be the efficient instrument of theological rationalization of religious doctrine. Now, there was a well-known dictum of Anselm of Canterbury, the philosopher of the 11th century: Fides coherens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. So, philosophical ideas and arguments, they were transformed and adapted for the purpose of just clarifying the foundations of Christian doctrine. And the medieval thinkers, they philosophized because they wished to understand Christianity. Yeah? So, a major part of the task of clarification of the foundations of Christian doctrine involved demonstrating that Christianity is not incompatible with what can be demonstrated by reason. There are two periods of medieval philosophy. These periods are distinguished by the historians of medieval culture and thought: the period of patristic philosophy and the period of scholastic philosophy. The term patristic philosophy covers activities by the early Christian writers. They're called patristic writers because mainly they were the fathers of the Orthodox Christian churches. But some of them, such as Origen, they were not attributed with this high status of being the father of churches, because some of the doctrines of those other thinkers were considered to be not compatible with the Orthodox dogmatic views. Nevertheless, all those writers, they contribute to the development of medieval philosophy and Christian doctrine as well. And that is why we use the term patristic more broadly, to designate the Christian writers, Orthodox and heterodox, who were active in the first 6 centuries of the Christian era. And then goes scholastic philosophy. Schola means school. Yeah? Scholasticism, it's a set of scholar and instructional techniques developed in Western Europe, specifically in the medieval universities. The period of scholasticism is characterized by an acceptance of the prevailing Catholic orthodoxy. Also, lots of original texts, specifically the texts of Aristotle, were translated from Greek into Latin, and they had eventually become accessible to theologians and philosophers of Western Europe. So there was recognition of the fact that Aristotle and Plato, they were the prominent ancient thinkers, but they disagreed about the notion of universals and the question about the status of universals, universal entities or universal concepts or universal meanings of words was one of the prominent questions of which theologians used to conduct disputes. So there was a growing prominence and importance of dialectical thinking and syllogistic reasoning that was due to the influence of Aristotle's logical treatises. Also, there was an acceptance of the distinction between natural and revealed theology and the disposition to analyze concepts, terms, to clarify our conceptual frameworks and to dispute everything. But once again, this philosophical project was closely related to the Orthodox doctrine because some of the dogmatic principles of the Orthodox Christian doctrine were taken as premises which can be used in deductive arguments developed by theologians and philosophers. Some of these premises were taken as being true axiomatically because their truth is warranted by the fact that this truth is acquired through, as it was assumed, divine illumination, for instance, or revelation. But other premises could be treated critically, could be considered and justified by the means of philosophical arguments. What were the main representatives, the prominent figures of the medieval philosophy? Among the most influential figures, first of all, I'd like to identify Aurelius Augustine, one of the prominent Latin fathers of church, the most influential figure in the early medieval period. Augustine applied Plato's thinking to Christianity. Yeah, he was influenced by Plato, by Neoplatonists, and he developed lots of interesting ideas on the status of personality, on the direction of historical process, on the substance of evil. He rejected that evil has some substance. It is simply the lack of goodness or the violation of some principle of hierarchy in the universe. And so Augustine proclaimed that his main goal is to study the nature of human soul and its relation to God. He's the author of the famous doctrine of divine illumination. Another very interesting and influential figure was Boethius, a thinker which operated in between 5th and 6th centuries. He's highly appreciated for the translation and commentary of Aristotle's logical works. And these translations helped to his contemporaries and subsequent philosophers to shape Latin technical philosophical vocabulary. Now we use some of these terms, such as substance, which is a translation of the original Greek term ousia, essence here, from Greek into Latin, or subject, object, and lots of other terms which are used even nowadays. Anselm of Canterbury was another prominent thinker, the thinker of the 11th century. He's well known for his ontological argument, and he's also known as the father of scholasticism. Ontological argument is the argument of the existence of God, which assumes that we can infer the principle of God's reality and verify this statement that God is real through the analysis of the very idea of God. God is that which nothing greater can be thought of. And that is the definition of God, which, as Anselm claimed, is quite understandable even to those who do not believe in God. And then this ontological argument is developed as the explication of what is implicitly assumed in the very idea of God, defined as that which nothing greater can be thought of. You know, that's an interesting fact that this argument was rejected by some of his contemporaries. That later on it was criticized by Immanuel Kant, though Kant's criticism mainly addressed René Descartes' version of this argument. But still, even nowadays, this argument is under the discussion, and there are some new versions of this argument developed by the prominent American analytic philosophers who use the semantics of possible worlds in order to make the premises of this argument intelligible. So the other prominent thinkers of medieval philosophy, Peter Abelard, who operated between 11th and 12th century. He contributed greater to dialectics, to logical thinking, inquiry. And he elaborated a set of interesting arguments in the scholastic debate over the problem of the universals. So the whole body of Aristotle's work became available to Europe in the 12th and 13th century. They been translated from Greek into Latin, and some of the works were translated from the Arabian sources. So Thomas Aquinas was the greatest medieval thinker of the 13th century, who was the first who attempted to reconcile Christianity in an Aristotelian framework. And specifically, Aquinas used some of the refined Aristotelian concepts in order to develop a metaphysical system which could be compatible and could also be used in order to provide some rational ground for Christian doctrine. Aquinas explicated the very idea of God as a pure act of being, and he summarized 5 cosmological arguments for the existence of God. And among the later major thinkers were Duns Scotus, who was an opponent to Aquinas, the founder of a rather influential school of the late medieval philosophy, and of course William of Ockham, a nominalist of the 14th century. Just, you know, there is such a principle which is called Occam's razor. So we use this principle as the regulative foundation of the economy of our thinking. You know, even Francisco Suarez is worth being mentioned, though he operated much later in the 17th century, but maybe that was the last thinker who developed some ideas of scholasticism and who tried to summarize scholasticism and even to treat critically some ideas of scholasticism, but still he made an orthodox scholastic thinker, the last one maybe in Western Europe. Okay, so we have run out of time here. In our next lecture, we'll address some problems of the medieval philosophy. The doctrine of Aurelius Augustine and Thomas Aquinas will be in the focus of our primary interest, and I'll show you what it is like to be here. The philosopher who intends to provide some rational ground for the acceptance of theological truth, and how philosophy can be employed here for the justification of some theological problems and for the inquiry into the questions of theology. That was the main intention of medieval philosophy. Yeah? Okay, I guess that is all for today here.